What if science finally killed death? If you could live forever, would endless time be the ultimate gift? Or would it become a prison you can never escape?
Chapter 1. The Great Pause. The date was November 14th, 2042. History would record it not as a day of war or peace, but as the day the biological clock stopped ticking. Dr. Aris Thorne sat alone in the sterile hum of the Cambridge Genesis laboratory, staring at a monitor that displayed the impossible. On the screen, a culture of human skin fibroblasts, designated sample 89C, was thriving. By all laws of biology, these cells should have entered a state of senescence weeks ago. They should have become zombie cells, unable to divide, spewing inflammatory toxins that signal the beginning of the end. Instead, they were vibrant, elastic, and indistinguishable from samples taken from a newborn. The breakthrough was not magic, it was the defeat of the Hayflick limit. Since the mid-20th century, scientists knew that human cells could only divide approximately 50 times before they stopped. This limit was dictated by telomeres, the protective caps at the ends of our chromosomes. Think of them like the plastic tips on shoelaces. Every time a cell divides, the tip gets a little shorter. Eventually, the lace frays, the DNA becomes unstable, and the body begins to fail. That is what we called aging. Dr. Thorne had not just found a way to slow this fraying, he had engineered a synthetic enzyme, Kronos 5, that locked the telomeres in a state of permanent regeneration without triggering the uncontrolled growth of cancer. When the news broke, it didn't happen with fireworks. It started as a confused murmur in the scientific community, then a wave of denial, and finally, a stunned silence that blanketed the globe. The treatment was simple, a viral vector delivery system that rewrote the genetic instruction manual in every cell of the human body. For the first few months, the change was invisible. People woke up, brushed their teeth, and went to work. But internally, a biological revolution was taking place. The body's cleanup mechanisms, usually overwhelmed by the debris of metabolism after age 30, were suddenly supercharged. Proteasomes began scrubbing cells clean of misfolded proteins. The buildup of lipofuscin, the age pigment that clogs our cells, began to dissolve. 35-year-olds realized they were no longer waking up with back pain. 60-year-olds found their vision sharpening. The physical decline that humanity had accepted as the inevitable price of existence had simply been cancelled. But as the physical relief washed over the population, a psychological frost began to settle. Aris Thorne watched the celebrations from his apartment window, a glass of scotch in his hand. He realized something the cheering crowds had not yet grasped. By removing the expiration date, he had inadvertently removed the definition of a lifetime. Death was no longer a natural conclusion. It was now exclusively an accident. You could still be hit by a car or crushed by a falling building, but time was no longer your assassin. The Reaper had been fired. As the sun set on that first year of the new era, humanity stood on the precipice of the Great Pause. We were biologically frozen in our prime. We were perfect machines, and we had absolutely no idea what to do with ourselves. Chapter 2. The Economic Shockwave. The first casualty of immortality wasn't religion or philosophy, it was the pension fund. In the old world, the global economy was built on a grim but reliable promise: people would die. This certainty allowed actuaries to calculate risk, insurance companies to price policies, and governments to budget for social security. The entire financial architecture of the 20th and early 21st centuries relied on the intergenerational contract. The young worked to support the old, with the understanding that they would one day be the old, supported by a new generation of the young. When the death rate plummeted to near zero, that contract was not just breached, it was incinerated. It started with the actuarial crash of 2045. Almost overnight, every life insurance policy became worthless because the payout condition, death, was no longer occurring. Conversely, annuity funds and pension schemes, which were designed to pay out until death, suddenly faced liabilities that stretched into infinity. The math simply broke. How do you pay a monthly stipend to a retiree for 10,000 years? You don't. Governments froze assets. The concept of retirement was abolished within a decade. The logic was brutal but irrefutable. If your body is biologically 30, you cannot claim the benefits of being 65, regardless of your birth year. The retirement age was raised to infinity. For the first time in history, the career ladder stopped moving. In the corporate world, the silver ceiling became the concrete ceiling. CEOs, board members, and tenured professors, who would historically have stepped down due to declining health or death, now remained in their positions indefinitely. They had the experience of a century and the energy of a youth. There was no room for advancement. A generation of ambitious 30-year-olds found themselves trapped in junior roles for decades. The phrase, "dead man's shoes," lost its meaning because the shoes were never vacated. Innovation began to stagnate as the same minds held the reins of power for 50, then 60, then 70 years. The energetic turnover that drove progress, the fresh eyes of new leadership, was gone. The shockwave hit the housing market next. Historically, real estate wealth was transferred through inheritance. Grandpa died, the house was sold or passed down. But now, Grandpa was still hiking in the Andes and had no intention of giving up his primary residence. The flow of assets from one generation to the next dried up completely. Wealth became sticky. If you owned property before the cure, you were a lord of the new era. If you didn't, you were a serf in a rental market where vacancies were non-existent. Then came the crisis of marriage. The vow, "until death do us part," was written when life expectancy was 40 years. When forever truly meant forever, the psychological weight of the commitment crushed millions of relationships. Divorce rates skyrocketed not out of malice, but out of sheer suffocation. The legal system had to adapt, introducing renewable term marriages, 5, 10, or 20-year contracts that expired unless both parties agreed to renew. By year 50 of the Age of Eternity, the world had stabilized into a gerontocracy disguised as a meritocracy. We had solved the problem of dying, only to create a world where it was impossible to truly live. The economy was no longer a cycle of growth and renewal. It was a static, calcified monument to the people who happened to be in charge when the clock stopped. Chapter 3. The One-Child Century. Population Control. The most terrifying graph in human history wasn't a stock market crash or a climate model. It was the simple, vertical line of global population growth in the decade following the cure. For 200,000 years, the human equation had been balanced by a grim subtraction. People were born and people died. The net increase was manageable because death constantly cleared the board. But when the subtraction stopped, the addition became a catastrophe. By the time the population hit 12 billion in 2060, the panic was palpable. Food systems were buckling. Water wars were erupting in regions that had been stable for centuries. The Earth was a finite container, and humanity was filling it like gas expanding in a sealed jar. The United Nations, now a global governing body with unprecedented emergency powers, passed the Replacement Act, colloquially known as the One In, One Out law. The legislation was draconian, absolute, and logically flawless. It stated a simple truth: on a finite planet, you cannot have infinite life and infinite birth simultaneously. Reproduction was no longer a biological right, it was a transactional privilege. Mandatory sterilization became the standard medical procedure at puberty, reversible only by a government-issued procreation license. To obtain a license, a vacancy had to be created. This meant that for a couple to have a child, someone else had to exit existence. In the early days, this created a gruesome black market for exit tokens. Wealthy families paying the desperate or the depressed to undergo voluntary euthanasia so that a new heir could be born. The moral horror of buying a death to buy a life tore society apart. The government quickly cracked down, nationalizing the death process. A global lottery was established, but the math was stubborn. Since almost no one died of natural causes, the birth rate effectively dropped to zero. The cultural impact was devastating. We entered the era of the silent playgrounds. Imagine a world without children. No schools, no toy stores, no cartoons. The sound of a child's laughter became a rare, almost mythical noise, heard only in the exclusive enclaves of the lottery winners. For the vast majority of the population, the youngest person they knew was 50 years old. We began to forget what innocence looked like. Without the constant influx of blank slates, new minds that hadn't yet been jaded by the world, cynicism calcified into a global temperament. We lost the beginner's mind. There were no more teenagers to rebel against the status quo, no more toddlers to ask why. The questions stopped because everyone already knew the answers. Psychologically, this solidified a deep collective narcissism. When you don't have children, you don't have to think about the future in the same way. You don't plant trees for your grandchildren, you plant them for yourself. The concept of legacy vanished because you were your own legacy. You weren't building a world for the next generation, you were maintaining a world for your eternal self. By the end of the first century of immortality, the human race had become a closed loop, a stagnant pool. We were safe, we were healthy, and we were incredibly, profoundly lonely. We had traded the chaos of renewal for the stability of a museum. And like a museum, everything was preserved, but nothing was growing. Chapter 4: The Plasticity Paradox, the Human Brain. If the body was a machine that could be repaired indefinitely, the brain was a hard drive that had never been formatted. And by the 2nd century of the Age of Eternity, that hard drive was full. It began subtly. It wasn't dementia. It wasn't the degradation of neurons. In fact, the Chronos V treatment kept our neurons as healthy as a 20-year-old's. The hardware was perfect. The problem was the software. The problem was storage. We called it the overwrite. Human memory evolved to prioritize the immediate over the ancient. The hippocampus, the brain's librarian, sorts memories by relevance and emotional weight. It relies on a process called synaptic pruning, the biological equivalent of deleting old files to free up space for new ones. In a normal lifespan of 80 years, this system works perfectly. You remember your childhood because it forms the foundation of your identity, and you have enough disk space to hold a life's worth of key moments. But what happens when the life is 500 years long? Dr. Thorne found himself standing in front of a mirror one morning, trying to recall the face of his mother. He knew facts about her. She was kind, she had blue eyes, she died before the cure. But the image, the sensory texture of her face, was gone. It hadn't faded, it had been deleted. The neural pathways that held that specific pattern of information had been repurposed to store the layout of the new Mars colony or the syntax of a new programming language he had learned last decade. To learn, we must forget. That is the fundamental law of neuroplasticity. The tragedy of immortality was not that we couldn't learn new things. It was that we couldn't hold on to the old ones. We became a species of eternal tourists in our own lives. A man could be married to his wife for 300 years, but he could no longer remember the moment they met. He couldn't remember the spark. He only knew that he loved her because he had a habit of loving her. The emotional origin story had been overwritten by centuries of mundane breakfasts and routine conversations. Identity drift became the primary psychological crisis of the era. Without a solid anchor in our past, our personalities became fluid, untethered. Who are you if you can't remember the events that shaped you? We tried to compensate with technology. External memory drives became as essential as clothing. People walked around with terabytes of data streaming into augmented reality glasses, constantly reminding them of who they were supposed to be. "You liked vanilla ice cream in 2050, the algorithm would whisper. "You hated jazz in 2010. We outsourced our souls to the cloud because our biological wetware simply couldn't handle the bandwidth of eternity. The plasticity paradox revealed a cruel irony. We had conquered death, but in doing so, we had fractured the self. We were no longer continuous beings. We were a series of short stories stitched together, pretending to be a novel. The person I was in 2040 was effectively a stranger to the person I am in 2040. We shared the same body, the same name, and the same social security number, but we shared almost no memories. I was not an immortal man. I was a ship of Theseus, replacing my memories plank by plank until nothing of the original remained. I was surviving, yes, but was I still me? Chapter 5. The stagnation of culture, risk aversion. There is an old scientific adage attributed to the physicist Max Planck. Science advances one funeral at a time. A new truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die and a new generation grows up that is familiar with it. In the age of eternity, the opponents never died. By the year 2150, culture had not just slowed, it had petrified. The new wave of cinema, literature, and music simply never arrived because the old wave refused to leave the beach. Why would a studio take a risk on an experimental young director when the legendary auteurs of the 21st century were still alive, still perfectly healthy, and still making films? We entered the era of the eternal sequel. The charts were dominated by the 40th album of bands that had formed in the 1990s. The bestseller lists were locked down by authors who had been publishing for 200 years. They had the brand recognition, the capital, and the distribution networks. A debut novelist didn't stand a chance against a writer with 2 centuries of fan loyalty. But the stagnation went deeper than just market dynamics. It was biological. It was the risk-reward ratio of immortality. When you have a life expectancy of 80 years, risking your life for a cause, a piece of art, or a thrill makes sense. You have limited time anyway, you might as well spend it boldly. But when you have the potential for infinite life, the value of your remaining time becomes infinite. Consequently, the cost of losing it becomes infinite. We became a species of cowards. Extreme sports vanished. Exploration of dangerous frontiers halted. Why climb Everest if there is a 0.1% chance of falling? In a finite life, that's a calculated risk. In an infinite life, it's a mathematical insanity. You are betting eternity against a fleeting adrenaline rush. This extreme risk aversion bled into innovation. Venture capital dried up for disruptive technologies. Investors, now planning for millennia of stability, preferred steady, low-yield returns over high-risk moonshots. The chaotic, destructive energy that drives capitalism, Schumpeter's creative destruction, was replaced by creative preservation. We perfected what we already had, but we stopped inventing what we needed. Cars became safer, more efficient, and lasted forever. But we stopped trying to invent teleportation. Phones became extensions of our bodies, but we stopped trying to invent telepathy. The urgency was gone. "We can do it next century" became the global motto. The scientific consensus was that we had trapped ourselves in a local maximum. In evolutionary biology, a species needs death to adapt. Death clears away the obsolete traits, the maladaptive behaviors, the rigid thinking. Without death, the organism, or in our case, the society, becomes rigid. We were perfectly adapted to the world of 2050, and we were terrified of changing it. We lived in a beautiful, curated garden where nothing ever rotted, but nothing new ever bloomed. The architecture was flawless, the music was technically perfect, and the politics were incredibly stable. But it was all beige. It was the culture of a retirement home extended to the scale of a planet. Safe, quiet, and utterly devoid of the fire that comes from knowing your time is running out.
Chapter 6: The Long Voyage, Expansion to Space.
For the first century of the Age of Eternity, we looked inward. We obsessed over our economies, our memories, and our boredom. But eventually, the sheer weight of time forced us to look up. Space travel had always been limited by a single cruel variable: human lifespan. The nearest star system, Proxima Centauri, is 4.2 light-years away. With 21st century propulsion, a voyage there would take 6,300 years. For a mortal, that is a death sentence. It required generational ships, floating tombs where the people who arrived would be the great-great-great-grandchildren of the people who left. But for us, for a species that had cured death, 6,300 years was simply a commitment. It was a long project, yes, but it was survivable. The time barrier to interstellar travel had evaporated. We didn't need faster-than-light drives to cheat physics. We just needed patience to outwait it. In 2018, the United Earth Coalition launched the Aeon, the first sleepless interstellar vessel. There were no cryopods, no suspended animation chambers. The crew of 50 didn't need to sleep through the journey to save resources or sanity. They intended to live through every single minute of the voyage. Captain Elara Vance stood on the bridge as Earth shrank to a pale blue dot, then a star, then nothing. She wasn't an astronaut in the traditional sense. She was a historian and a geologist. She had signed up for a mission that would return, if it ever returned, long after the Earth she knew had changed beyond recognition. The biology of the crew was uniquely suited for the void. The same Chronos V treatment that halted aging also supercharged their DNA repair mechanisms. Cosmic radiation, the silent killer of space travel, was merely a nuisance. The high-energy particles that would have shredded a mortal's genome were repaired almost instantly by their enhanced enzymes. We had inadvertently built the perfect biological spacesuit. But the challenge wasn't radiological, it was psychological. Imagine being trapped in a metal can with the same 49 people for a millennium. The Aeon wasn't just a ship, it was a pressurized social experiment. To maintain sanity, the crew developed a culture of microcycles. They didn't count years, they counted masteries. A crew member would spend 50 years mastering the violin, then the next 50 learning quantum mechanics, then the next 50 gardening in the hydroponic bays. They rotated roles, lovers, and hobbies with a fluidity that would have seemed insane to a mortal. There was no rush. If a calculation regarding the ship's trajectory took a decade to solve, they took the decade. The urgency of mission critical was replaced by the thoroughness of mission eternal. Yet, as the Aeon drifted through the silent, dark gap between stars, a profound shift occurred. The crews stopped caring about the destination. Proxima Centauri became an abstract concept, a point on a map that they might reach eventually. The journey became the destination. They were the first humans to truly understand the scale of the universe. To a mortal, the void is terrifying because it represents the nothingness of death. To the crew of the Aeon, the void was a mirror. In the absolute silence of deep space, stripped of the noise of Earth's stagnant culture, they found a strange, monastic peace. They were no longer Earthlings. They were creatures of the vacuum, thriving in the empty spaces where time didn't matter because there was nothing to measure it against. They had become the true children of the cosmos, patient, cold, and enduring. Back on Earth, people watched the telemetry fade. To those left behind, the Aeon was a symbol of hope, a sign that humanity was still moving, even if it was moving very, very slowly. But to Alara and her crew, Earth was just a memory they were slowly, happily overwriting.
Chapter 7. The Boredom Epidemic. Psychological Entropy.
If you eat your favorite meal every day for a week, you love it. If you eat it every day for a month, you tolerate it. If you eat it every day for a century, you would rather starve. By the year 2030, humanity had not starved of food, but we were starving of feeling. We called it the Great Grey. The human brain is wired for contrast. Happiness is not a state, it is a spike relative to a baseline. We need the cold to appreciate the warmth. We need the fear of loss to appreciate the joy of gain. But in a world where loss had been surgically removed, the baseline flatlined. Dr. Aris Thorne, now looking biologically 30 but chronologically 300, walked into the Adrenaline Lounge in downtown Neo-Tokyo. It wasn't a bar, it was a clinic for the emotionally numb. Inside, people paid exorbitant sums to be terrified. They were strapped into hyper-realistic simulations of drowning, falling, or being hunted by predators. For a few precious minutes, their amygdalas would fire, cortisol would flood their systems, and they would remember what it felt like to be alive. They would gasp, sweat, and scream. And then, when the simulation ended, they would pay the bill with a dead-eyed expression and walk back out into the safety of eternity. This was the hedonic treadmill running at light speed. Neurologically, the problem was dopamine downregulation. Our reward systems were never designed for infinite uptime. Over centuries of constant stimulation, constant entertainment, constant pleasure, constant safety, our receptors had become desensitized. We needed higher and higher doses of novelty just to feel a flicker of interest. But the world, safe and stagnant, offered less and less. Suicide, once a tragedy of mental illness or despair, transformed into a philosophical choice. It became the voluntary exit. It wasn't done out of sadness, it was done out of completion. People would throw exit parties. They would gather their friends, those who hadn't already left, give away their possessions, and calmly explain that they had simply seen enough. They had read every book worth reading, loved everyone worth loving, and seen every sunset variation the atmosphere could produce. They were full. "I am not unhappy," a famous poet wrote in his final public letter before his exit. "I am just finished." A painting is not beautiful because it goes on forever. It is beautiful because it is framed. I am framing myself. The government tried to intervene, launching purpose programs to assign new, arbitrary goals to the listless population. Learn to terraform Mars. Master the viola. But you cannot legislate meaning. Meaning is derived from scarcity. Time is the currency of value. And when we printed infinite time, we hyperinflated the currency of life until it was worthless. We realized too late that death was not the opposite of life. It was the engine of it. Without the deadline, we stopped doing the work. We stopped striving. We just existed. Like stones in a river, smooth, unchanged, and utterly passive. The clinics were always full. The exit centers had waiting lists, and the people who remained walked through the perfect, safe streets of the future, desperately searching for a problem they couldn't solve, just to feel the exquisite pain of trying.
Chapter 8. The Divide. The Immortals versus the Naturals. They called them the Mayflies. It was a derogatory slur used by the eternal majority to describe the fleeting, fragile lives of the Naturals. By the year 2350, the human species had effectively speciated, not biologically, but ideologically. On one side stood the Immortals, the Homo Eternus, beautiful, static, and accumulating wealth and knowledge with the compounding power of centuries. On the other side were the Naturals, the Homo sapiens, who rejected the Chronos 5 treatment on religious, philosophical, or ethical grounds. The Naturals lived in preservation zones, vast reservations that looked like 21st century agrarian societies. To an immortal, entering a preservation zone was like stepping into a horror movie. They saw things they hadn't seen in centuries: wrinkles, grey hair, walking canes, and hospitals filled with the sick. They saw death. Dr. Aris Thorne, driven by a gnawing emptiness that the adrenaline lounges couldn't fix, visited the Appalachian zone in late autumn. He walked through a market where a woman, clearly in her 80s, was selling apples. Her face was a map of time, deep crevices around her eyes, skin like parchment. To Aris, she looked monstrous. To her, Aris looked like a plastic doll. Why? Aris asked her, buying an apple he didn't need. The treatment is free. The government mandates it for integration. Why choose this? He gestured vaguely at her frailty. The woman smiled, and the map of her face shifted beautifully. Because a story needs an ending, young man, she said. Her voice had a gravelly texture that no immortal possessed. If you never leave the party, you never appreciate the night. You are just lingering. The divide wasn't just aesthetic, it was an evolutionary chasm. Scientists had begun to notice a terrifying trend. The immortals were genetically frozen. Their DNA was locked in the state it was in when they took the cure. Mostly late 20th or early 21st century genetics. They were immune to aging, but they were no longer evolving. The Naturals, however, were still playing the game of natural selection. They were dying, yes, but they were also birthing new generations with new mutations. In the 3 centuries since the cure, the Naturals had gone through 12 generations. They were subtly adapting to the slightly warmer climate, their metabolisms were shifting, and their immune systems were learning to handle new, post-industrial pathogens that the Immortals' static biology had to fight with heavy pharmaceuticals. The Naturals were dynamic. The Immortals were a snapshot. Economically, the gap was unbridgeable. This was the compound interest caste system. An immortal who invested $10 in 2050 and let it sit for 300 years possessed wealth that a natural with a 40-year working life could not comprehend. The Immortals owned the land, the banks, the patents, and the government. The Naturals were essentially pets of the state, kept in their zones as living museum exhibits of how we used to live. But looking at the apple seller, Aris felt a pang of something he hadn't felt in decades. Jealousy. She had urgency. She had a granddaughter clinging to her leg, a sight Aris hadn't seen in a century due to the strict population laws in the immortal cities. She was teaching the child how to pick the best fruit, passing on wisdom because she knew she wouldn't be there to do it forever. Her mortality gave her actions weight. Aris walked back to the sleek, magnetic levitation train that would take him back to the Silver City. He was perfect, he was rich, he was timeless. And as he looked at his reflection in the window, smooth, unblemished, and utterly identical to the day he took the cure, he realized he was obsolete. The Naturals were the future because they were the only ones still changing. He was just history that refused to leave the room. Chapter 9.
The planet's revenge, environmental feedback. For the first 2 centuries of the Age of Eternity, we treated the Earth like a rental car. We drove it hard, assuming that if we broke it, we would just fix it with the same godlike technology that fixed our bodies. We were wrong. Nature plays the long game, and while we had stopped our own biological clocks, the rest of the biosphere kept ticking, evolving, and adapting. The first sign of the rebellion was not a storm or a heat wave, it was a sneeze. In 2412, a new strain of influenza emerged in the tropical zones. We called it the rust. To a natural human with an evolving immune system, it was a bad week in bed. But to an immortal, whose immune system was essentially a snapshot of the year 2042, it was devastating. We have forgotten the Red Queen hypothesis. In evolutionary biology, a species must constantly adapt just to stay in the same place relative to its predators and parasites. By freezing our biology to stop aging, we had stopped running. We had locked our defenses in the 21st century, while the viruses and bacteria had spent 300 years picking the locks. The rust tore through the megacities. It didn't kill us, we were too robust for that, but it incapacitated us. It caused chronic inflammation, fatigue, and a deep cellular exhaustion that Kronos V couldn't fix. The hospitals, empty for decades, were suddenly overflowing with people whose perfect bodies were under siege by a microscopic enemy that had simply outlearned them. Simultaneously, the planet's macrosystems began to buckle under the weight of the forever footprint. In a mortal society, consumption is cyclical. You are born, you consume resources for 80 years, and then you die. Your carbon footprint has a cap. But an immortal? Their footprint is a runaway train. A single immortal, over the course of 4 centuries, consumed the energy equivalent of 5 generations of mortals. They needed housing that never freed up. They needed electricity that never turned off. They bought gadgets, clothes, and vehicles in a never-ending stream. The waste didn't decompose because we didn't decompose. We had broken the carbon cycle. We were taking from the earth, but never giving anything back, not even our own bodies. The climate shifted into a state of hyperstability. The weather became erratic, violent, and vindictive. The oceans, absorbing the heat of a civilization that refused to power down, acidified to the point where marine life collapsed. We responded with geoengineering, massive sunshades in orbit, carbon scrubbers the size of cities, but it was like putting a band-aid on a gunshot wound. We were fighting a war against the very system that sustained us. Dr. Aris Thorne watched the news from his sealed, air-filtered apartment. The screen showed dust storms swallowing the agricultural belts and seawalls breaching in the coastal megacities. He realized the terrifying truth. The Earth was treating humanity exactly like we treated a virus. We were replicating without limit. We were consuming without pause. We were toxic to the host. The planet's response was an immune reaction. The storms, the heat, the shifting pathogens, these were the fever. The Earth was trying to burn us out. We had achieved individual immortality, but we had doomed the collective habitat. We were the cancer cells of Gaia, immortal, voracious, and ultimately suicidal. If the host dies, the cancer dies. Aris looked at his hand, unblemished and strong. He realized that his survival was the problem. The greatest act of environmentalism wouldn't be recycling or solar power, it would be dying. But that was the one thing nobody was willing to do. Chapter 10. The Last Sunset, the Heat Death. The end did not come with a bang nor a whimper. It came with a flicker. Dr. Aris Thorne sat on the observation deck of the Omega Station, a structure built not of metal, but of harvested starlight and binding energy, orbiting the last active black hole in the local group. The date was meaningless. The calendar had been abandoned eons ago, shortly after the last natural star in the Milky Way had burned through its hydrogen fuel and collapsed into a white dwarf. We were now deep in the degenerate era of the cosmos. The universe had expanded so much that other galaxies had long since disappeared beyond the cosmic horizon, carried away by dark energy faster than the speed of light. The sky was no longer a tapestry of diamonds. It was a wall of absolute, crushing black, punctuated by the faint, dying glow of proton decay. Aris was tired, not physically. His body, maintained by eons of genetic updates and cybernetic reinforcements, was as perfect as the day he cured aging in Cambridge. But his soul was heavy with the weight of 1 billion years of memory. He had loved and lost so many times that grief had become a background hum, a tinnitus of the heart. He had mastered every art, solved every equation, and walked on the surface of worlds that had long since turned to dust. He looked at the display. The black hole, designated Terminus, was evaporating. Stephen Hawking had predicted this in the 20th century. Even black holes are not immortal. They leak radiation, slowly shrinking until they explode and vanish. Terminus was the last campfire in a freezing night, and it was burning low. This was the second law of thermodynamics, the final boss that even the immortals could not defeat. Entropy. The universe tends toward disorder. Energy flows from hot to cold until everything is the same uniform temperature. Absolute zero. Maximum entropy. We had cured biological death, but we could not cure cosmological death. We had built a house that lasted forever, only to realize the land it stood on was crumbling into the sea. Status, Aris whispered. His voice was the only sound in the station. Output at 0.004%, the station's AI replied. It was not a robot, it was a collective consciousness of the billions of humans who had uploaded themselves to the cloud eons ago, choosing a digital dream over the stark reality of the freezing universe. Collapse imminent. Aris stood up. He walked to the viewing port. He was one of the few corporeals left, those who refused to upload, who insisted on keeping their physical bodies until the very end. He wanted to feel the cold. He wanted to see the dark with his own retinas. He thought back to the beginning, to the excitement of the cure, to the arrogance of thinking they had defeated nature. They hadn't defeated it, they had just paused the game. And now, the battery was running out. For the first time in 1 billion years, Aris felt something he hadn't felt since he was a mortal man in the 21st century. He felt fear. But beneath the fear, there was something else. A profound, vibrating sense of relief. A story without an end is not a story. It is a sentence. It is a prison of words. By removing death, they had removed the punctuation mark that gave life its structure. They had turned a beautiful song into a single, unending note that had become a scream. "It's time to finish the song," Aris said. He reached for the control panel. There was no escape pod. There was nowhere to go. The universe was everywhere, and everywhere was dying. The only choice left was how to meet it. He disengaged the station's containment field. The heat from the dying accretion disk washed over the sensors one last time. "Lights out," Aris commanded. The station's power cells, hoarding the last joules of energy harvested from 1 trillion years of history, shut down. The hum of the life support ceased. The artificial gravity faded, leaving him floating in the velvet dark. Outside, the black hole gave one final, violent spasm of Hawking radiation, a brilliant flash of gamma rays that illuminated the nothingness for a nanosecond, and then it vanished. The last light in the universe went out, and in the perfect, silent, eternal dark that followed, Aris Thorne finally found what he had been looking for since 2042. He found the end.